in matters related to urbanization. So urban growth is occurring particularly in the southeast and particularly in coastal areas. And so this area, the Mobile area, is definitely an area of interest when we talk about how we can sustain and protect natural resources in a landscape that is rapidly changing. So when I came to Auburn several years ago, get this on here. There we go. How about that? Huh? Several years ago. Alabama. I was part of a group that actually was interested in really critically evaluating the condition of water quantity, water quality, aquatic resources related to Wolf Bay. So this is looking from, I guess, sort of between Gulf Shores, Orange Beach, that perspective, looking an area needed an outstanding area that was like a lot of our coastal areas is, but in the top left corner you have the city of Foley, a rapidly expanding urban area. A little bit north of here is a smaller town, Alberta, also growing. So if you look at really the history or the area of, let's see if I can get rid of that. There we go. I hope I didn't just turn off the YouTube. Anyways, if we look at the area surrounding Wolf Bay, and this is pretty typical for a lot of coastal areas along the Gulf Coast, this is an area that's been rapidly changing. If we go up to, going back to 1992 to 2005, I don't know if you can read this legend. Oops. Get the right button there. But basically, wherever you see red, and this is the drainage area for Wolf Bay, that's an area that's been urbanized between those 2 years. So you're looking at an area between 1990 and 2000 that had a 43% increase in population. And then the following decade, a 24% increase in that population. So this is this has become a desirable place to work and live and clearly to recreate as well. And so this is an area that has undergone significant urbanization as a result. And the projection is for these kind of trends to continue. So this is actually a map out of the Southern Forest Future Project. This was an exercise done by the U.S. Forest Service. They really wanted to look at, from a county level perspective, what was going to be projections for forest change in the southeast United States. And again, if you can't see the legend numbers there, basically the yellows, the oranges, and browns are counties that between 1997 and 2060 are expected to experience some significant loss in forest land cover. And so forest land cover is in some regards dictated by the value of timber prices. From my perspective, and these changes bring with them concerns and management issues. So, as I mentioned, I'm a wetland ecologist. I'm also interested in water and how water moves through our environment. And if we look at places like Baldwin County, this is the southern part of Baldwin County, a lot of the drainage is dominated by these sort of smaller rivers, low-order streams that really sort of branch out and extend at pretty high density throughout the landscape and really draw in the water. Again, a lot of the drainage here is local. As land use changes, how is that going to influence the quality of water, in receiving bays like Wolf Bay or Perdido Bay, Weeks Bay, those areas that are going to be receiving waters from a landscape that basically increase the amount of impervious surface on that watershed. As we increase that impervious surface, we reduce the potential for water to infiltrate into the ground. And so by design, more of our precipitation will run off through stormwater systems into local streams and waterways. So there's less water going back into the ground. More of that water is just running off the landscape, and less of it is available for infiltration and evapotranspiration. And so again, this is by design. We have urban environments where we have to manage for water. We need to keep our urban environments safe. We need to control for flooding and things like that. So it is a necessity, although there is some things that we can do to implement management practices that can mitigate for this. But this is sort of the general phenomenon that occurs as areas become more urban. We oftentimes see more of that runoff going off of the landscape into our waterways. And so when you look at it from a stream perspective, which most work on urbanization and waterways has been looked at from a stream perspective, but oftentimes you would have naturally. Basically, instead of allowing water to sort of move through the ground and sort of slowly move to streams, we're bringing it much more rapidly. And as a result, streams are flowing with much higher discharge, much higher energy. Consequently, all the stuff that we have on our urban landscapes oftentimes gets moved into streams as well. So issues with water quality become problematic. This change in stream discharge, this increased energy oftentimes changes the stream environment. So if you have things like gully formations, stream scouring, this oftentimes becomes problematic because the stream is now, had a dramatically different, it has a different, discharge regime. It's basically getting more water faster. It tends to be a flashier system, meaning that because all the water is coming quickly in runoff, it also comes down from that peak discharge fairly quickly, as opposed to a more natural forested watershed where, normally we'd have a more gradual rise to a peak discharge that isn't at the same level as our urban watersheds, and then again a more gradual receding lem or lowering of discharge till eventually it gets back to our base flow condition. This is part of this idea of what's been termed the urban stream syndrome. And so clearly, when we talk about habitats and organisms that live in these streams, that's a critical change that occurs. There's been interesting work sort of relating this to riparian areas as well, so the areas adjacent to those streams. Groffman et al. Doing work at the Baltimore LTER were evaluating streams and came up with this term hydrologic drought to describe a phenomenon where because we have more water being run off as surface water and less water recharging the ground and sort of contributing to base flow, they found around Baltimore that urban streams oftentimes had water tables relative to the riparian ground surface were much lower than their more forested reference conditions. And so we're changing, not just the stream, but we're changing the conditions of that riparian environment surrounding those streams. So those understandings are out there and have been demonstrated in multiple scenarios. But I'll mention that there has been much less work done on these types of issues and our understanding in more coastal areas. And so, as I mentioned, with our work with Wolf Bay and some other work we've conducted, we've started looking at these coastal streams to see if some of these patterns and maybe the severity of impacts hold up in more coastal streams and coastal systems. So when we get into the coastal plain, the understanding was that usually the impacts may not be quite as severe because of a lower gradient. That steeper topography, you think about more mountainous regions, or even in the Piedmont parts of the southeast, these effects may be more severe. This is some work, though. We looked at a gradient of urbanization in different watersheds around the Apalachicola, Florida area. So this is Apalachicola Bay, and through a series of stream monitoring, we were able to detect shifts in this case, nitrate concentration, total phosphorus concentration in stream water that related to just how much impervious surface was in that watershed. And so there were some other measures that we looked at as well that were influenced, hydrologic, sediment loads, things like that. So we have demonstrated, and I should mention Apalachicola is not, it's not Mobile. It's a fairly rural town. The ranges of impervious surface are fairly low to moderate, but even at those low levels, we do see some evidence of an urbanization effect. So my interest has always been, my interest in coming down to Baldwin County really sort of moved to looking at headwaters. So we've identified headwaters as these important areas in terms of interface between what goes on the land and maybe the conditions downstream. Even though this is recognized, a lot of our headwater streams, and I'll talk about headwater wetlands, have been neglected historically. They are some of the areas that we can easily displace. A lot of times they get filled, piped, culverted. They oftentimes are, ephemeral or intermittent streams that don't carry water year-round, and for that reason, they oftentimes get displaced. They are the sort of upriver extent or upstream extent in terms of our river and stream systems, but in terms of sort of the overall drainage length, they oftentimes represent, upwards of 70, 80, 90% of the total stream network within a watershed. So in Baldwin County, unlike maybe more in areas of the world where there's a little greater topography or elevation gradient, when we get into the coastal plain and we have these flatter areas, if you get into a stream or a creek and you start walking upstream, if you did this around here, you would follow a channel. That channel would get smaller and smaller, and eventually you might get into something that looks like this. These are headwater slope wetlands that occur throughout the coastal plain. They're very prevalent here in the coastal counties of Alabama, really the whole coastal plain of Alabama. So what happens is you get into a spot where the wetlands become the dominant drainage feature. The stream channel itself could essentially dissipate or it turns in maybe to a braided stream system that eventually may disappear altogether, and you have something like this. These are the headwater wetlands that occupy the watershed and oftentimes are the important interface when we talk about drainage from our lands around here. So this is what we've been looking at as part of our research. This is a headwater wetland near Foley. Typically, again, these are still fairly linear systems, so they are flow paths. They're conduits for water, but clearly without the energy to sort of form channels. A lot of times you have in the sort of better quality reference conditions, you have a topography like this where it's sort of a hummock hollow, the trees sort of occupying the hummocks, and then water oftentimes may be standing in some of these hollows, sometimes not. These aren't wetlands that get flooded over long durations. Oftentimes they're just saturated soils. But oftentimes because they're groundwater driven, they tend to stay wet for long durations. The water table is oftentimes at or near the surface, but they don't tend to stay flooded. They don't have deep floods that often. Around here, the one species that we found that was the dominant species and occurred pretty much in every one of these systems was sweetbay, Magnolia virginiana. That was the universal tree species that we found in these. So these tend to be oftentimes bay dominated. There are some other bay species that occur, but sweetbay is the dominant species. But we see a lot of natural variation depending upon the wetness of the ground. In the very upper reaches, you can have a transition of bay and pine becoming more of a mix. In wetter scenarios, like the one in this picture, it may be a mix of bay and tupelo. But this is pretty common what you would see. As you go down, as you move downstream, again, eventually enough water coalesces, you do have the formation of a low-order stream channel. But again, a lot of times, even in a scenario like this, these swamps are really, their hydrology, their water table is dependent upon how much groundwater is coming into them. So if you want to look at this sort of from a geomorphic standpoint, this would be, again, a low-order creek here. The headwater wetlands tend to occupy this sort of interface between the uplands and then downstream sort of floodplain and streams and creeks. And so the idea here is that because of their position on the landscape, where we have forested landscapes and infiltration is high, that they are normally driven by groundwater, slowly moving into them to the point that eventually they coalesce enough water to form a stream channel. The problem is potentially is that as we become more urbanized and we have to manage for stormwater, and we have stormwater infrastructure, we increasingly use these wetlands as a depository for stormwater. They become increasingly surface water driven. And so we do see instances in highly urbanized areas where a lot of that stormwater is being deposited into these headwater systems, and they are now more surface water driven than groundwater driven. And so this has been that has really been sort of the crux of a lot of our questions and research related to wetland function. I'll show you just a few illustrations to sort of show you the sort of the fate or the condition of a lot of these wetlands in land uses that have been changed. And for around here, clearly land use change is both urban and agriculture. Urban is the sort of the predominant changing factor right now, but historically agriculture has been the most important land changer. But in either case, a lot of times we see headwater wetlands that are still on the landscape, but in various levels of maybe some impairment. But a lot of our headwater wetlands have basically been permanently lost. And so I was talking to Ruth at lunch today here about, a lot of times if you're driving around and you see a pasture and there's a ditch moving through that pasture, like in this picture, a fair chance that was probably once a headwater wetland swamp that was draining that. And so again, for the purpose of getting water off the land as quickly as possible, and if you're growing crops, that could be important. A lot of these were basically cut and then ditched for that reason. So this is, in this case, I think I got a little thing, yeah. I mean, this is your flow path. This is, the ditch sort of ends here, drains all here, but this is the remnant wetland, and it's still it was actually fairly well intact. It still receives water, albeit drainage from this agricultural field. A lot of headwater wetlands have been converted to ponds and sort of used as again, an element of stormwater treatment. So in the background there, at the other end of the pond, is actually a continuation of a wetland system. And from the perspective of this picture, if you were able to see behind, there is a wetland that drains into this pond. But this is again a treatment pond for a neighborhood or an area subdivision near Fairhope, where this was excavated and used as part of stormwater treatment. There's certainly plenty of examples, like I mentioned before, where we drain our parking lots, our urban infrastructure directly into headwater wetlands. So conduits for direct surface water there's plenty of examples out there. And we have a lot of areas in the coastal counties here where there is active construction going on. And so where we see active construction, like in this picture in Spanish Fort, we see examples where there's a lot of sediment that is getting washed into these wetlands. And so it's another impairment. That a lot of times we have wetlands that, when we look at them, they have basically become depository areas for sediment, significant amount of sediments in some cases. And then the other issue is when you increase that energy, a lot of times where there wasn't a channel or there wasn't a substantial channel, we create those channels indirectly by changing the flow regimes, such as in this wetland in Bay Minette. So these are, there's a wide range of impacts that land use can have on these systems. And so this is an illustration of, that's I-10 basically coming across Mobile Bay into Baldwin County. This is National Wetland Inventory Map. So just to give you the extent of the drainage, river systems like Fish River, sort of a main artery of drainage, but you have these sort of offshoots. All those little sort of spurs kind of coming off of those larger creeks tend to be some of our headwater wetland systems. If you look closely, though, there's some variation here. So north of I-10, there's still some very prevalent drainage and headwater wetland systems present there. But if you look south of I-10, you actually notice that a lot of those features are starting to disappear. And so if we click on, sort of the aerial imagery that goes with this, those areas where those features are falling out are areas that we've already have altered to a large extent. So I-10, that area, a lot of agriculture, and we got the city of Daphne and Spanish Fork here. Those are areas where the headwaters have basically been minimized, culverted, piped, or filled in otherwise. So that's it gives you a little backdrop. That is sort of my perspective and our lab's perspective, and so we have sort of this overarching research goal to really look at how does these land use changes influence these headwater wetlands and how they function. And so the functions are functions that are clearly important for us. Wetlands are known to improve water quality. They are known to store water, and they're also known to be critical and important habitats. So starting in about 2009, we started with a series of field studies to really look at this issue. And so I'm going to just sort of highlight some of the work that we've done and some of the results we've seen. But we've looked at things like, how does the forest community composition, the vegetation in those wetlands change across gradients of land use change? How does water storage and the hydrology, how is that influenced? Carbon cycling. So we've done some work looking at both leaf litter inputs, but also detritus in the wetlands and how much that gets retained related to sort of carbon cycling. I've had a student, Diane Alex, who did work looking at amphibian habitats. And so what type of amphibian species occupy these wetlands, which there really wasn't too much information about, and how much do these land use changes affect those organisms? And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about our most recent work looking at how, trying to really quantify the role that these wetlands have in water quality. So our general approach for this work is to basically evaluate wetlands over a wide range of surrounding land use conditions. And so initially we went out and we actually identified and examined 33 of these headwater wetlands in Baldwin County. And it took some time actually to find all these and find suitable examples. I should mention that these were all functioning wetlands in some perspective. Like the area I showed you of the farm field, there are certainly headwater systems that have been lost and just reduced to basically a ditch. All the systems that we had still had some wetland function to them. So they weren't the worst of the worst, but there was certainly a gradient in condition. And so, but our approach in selecting wetlands was to capture the range of land use conditions as they are in Baldwin County today. For each of these wetlands, we wanted to really quantify land use, land cover. We used the catchment of the wetland as sort of a sphere of influence, if you will. So if that's your wetland, we use digital elevation models to basically, along with GIS, to delineate the contributing watershed for each of those wetlands. And then using current aerial photography, we delineated the different major land use, land cover types. And so for our purposes, we ended up really just boiling things down to how much agriculture is present in the watershed, how much urban, and then there was just a couple miscellaneous categories. But agriculture and urban were the two major land use, land cover types, along, I should mention, with forest cover. So we wanted to know, a lot of times, how much forest cover was present as well. So using GIS, we delineated these watersheds, and this was, this is the range, just to kind of give you a perspective of the range of conditions, both size-wise and percentage of land use, land cover. The average watershed was about 86 hectares. So we're not talking about large, watersheds. These are small headwater catchments, which is actually advantageous when you're trying to get at some of the effects, because a lot of times there's not a lot of variety of land uses. It's a smaller systems kind of let you focus a little more. But average forest cover across all our sites was 45%. And you can see there's a tremendous range there. Likewise, agriculture, 27%, with a big range between 0 and 82%. And we did calculate the percentage of impervious surface area. We used that as a more precise measure of urban influence. Because if you think about it, urban could be a lot of things. It could be downtown Mobile. It could be the subdivision you live in, or it could be a handful of a small road. So we use percent impervious surface as our measure of urban influence, and that averaged about 3%. But you can see there was a sizable ranges with there as well. So one of the first things that we did is we really wanted to see what do we have out in these wetlands in terms of the vegetation structure. So I had a grad student, Flint Barksdale, who looked at, basically running vegetation surveys in all 33 of these wetlands to evaluate the types of vegetation that are present and how that might relate to land use, land cover. He used a principal components approach to evaluating his land use, land cover data. But on the figure on the top left there, what it shows is that essentially as the amount of urban land use surrounding these wetlands decreased, we saw a predictable decrease in the amount of exotic shrub cover. And so in Baldwin County, when we talk about exotic shrubs, you're primarily talking about Chinese privet. The Chinese privet, in some cases, was very extensive, particularly in some of our urban areas. So you're talking about wetlands that have cover, in excess of 50 to 60%. And that wasn't particularly surprising. We've read other accounts of, as we open up the landscape, as we change the landscape, we're basically providing or creating environments where invasive species can invade and oftentimes be successful. What we weren't anticipating was some of the data related to our canopy trees. And so we looked at canopy trees that were larger than 5 centimeters DBH to look at how dense they were, how much of those trees we have. What we also found related to this same component that was correlated with urban land use is that in our as urbanization goes down, as we get into, or I should say, as urbanization goes up, or the amount of urban land use goes up, we get fewer and fewer of those canopy trees in our wetlands. And this hasn't been documented as much, but there is some evidence out there that have seen something similar to this. And the explanation here is that what is going on after enough time is that when you have a high shrub cover of, in this case, of Chinese privet, it can get dense enough that it basically precludes the ability for the native trees to reproduce. So you're basically having in the understory an environment that is so shaded that no understory vegetation is growing, and also as a result of that, you're not getting the tree recruitment. So as trees are dying back, they aren't being replaced, and we're seeing the potential of a loss of our native trees in this case as areas become more urban. Flint also looked at the soil conditions, and we wanted to see in the top 15 centimeters at least if there was some notable change in soil morphology. One thing we looked at is soil chroma, which is really sort of a measure of color purity. Anybody that is familiar with wetland soils knows that soil chroma is sort of an important indicator of anaerobic conditions, that as your chroma, as you get into the lower chroma ranges here, it's oftentimes an indication of saturated soils. It's actually an indicator of hydric soils that's used for delineation purposes. And what we found is related to our other component that correlated with forest cover in our watershed, we have a trend of higher soil chromas where we're losing some of that forest cover. And again, we can't be certain this is just correlations, but it suggests that there's a couple things that could be going on. One, that we are losing perhaps our groundwater table, and those soils are not staying anaerobic as long as they used to, sort of driving that higher soil chroma. The other thing that we do see is a lot of sediment input, and sort of maybe a combination of these two things are sort of driving soils. We're getting sort of soils with higher chromas, i.e. more aerobic conditions. We also looked at using a subset of these wetlands. We wanted to look at hydrology and carbon dynamics. So we selected about half these wetlands, 15 wetlands, to look at this specifically. We use groundwater wells with shallow groundwater wells with water level recorders and data loggers, pressure transducers, to monitor the water tables in these wetlands, again, capturing a range of land use, land cover conditions. We use this SCS method to calculate runoff curves. And runoff curves, it's basically a modeling approach to taking the soil drainage class combined with the land uses to give you these curve numbers that can be then used to estimate the amount of surface runoff that would be expected after a precipitation event. So we use these curve numbers as an index, essentially, of runoff. But we did calculate total discharge, but also looking at other soil conditions related to carbon and relating that to land use, land cover. And we wanted to see, particularly we were interested in sort of leaf litter and the fate of litter fall in these wetlands. In the reference wetlands we saw, there's a substantial litter layer that oftentimes occupies these swamps. If you think about that hummock hollow topography, it's actually very conducive to sort of retaining and building up of organic matter at the wetland surface. But we saw other examples where that topography has changed and where we saw a lot less litter cover in the soils. And so when we looked at this and related this measure of forest floor carbon, which is basically the amount of litter fall that was on the ground surface, if you're looking at the top right graph there, basically there was a relationship between the watershed curve number, i.e. how much runoff we could expect, and how much of this forest floor litter occupied the wetlands. So we sampled this forest floor litter by basically going out there bi-monthly and just taking random plots and just sampling what was on the ground, taking it back, dry weighing it, and figuring out the carbon present there. But what we see is, a decrease as we get more runoff and how much litter is occupying that. The figure on the bottom right is showing the ratio of the carbon on the forest floor relative to the input, the amount of litter fall that actually came into the wetlands. So we're like, well, maybe it's not so much what's going on the bottom, but just a difference in the relative amounts of input that each of these wetlands get as far as litter fall. But if you basically adjust the data to account for the amount of litter fall, the relationship holds up. And basically what we think we're seeing here is that when we have wetlands becoming more surface water driven, and particularly with that high energy flow, it's basically flushing a lot of these wetlands out. So in between rain events, you'll see, this is a more urbanized one, a lot of these, a lot of export of this litter fall. And so if you're thinking about organisms that may be living in these wetlands, that's a significant change in some of the habitat that's occupying in here. The curve number also was, when we related our groundwater data, this Richard Baker index is just an index of how flashy the water table was. And what we found is curve number was a pretty good way to estimate wetlands that have a water table that just fluctuate much more rapidly. And that was what we were expecting as well. And that related both the curve number we did, as I mentioned, actually estimate the amount of discharge, of how much runoff occurred in these watersheds using that curve number. But in both cases, we see as urban land use increases and this curve number increases, it influences the hydrology of the water in these wetlands. Around this time, we also started some work looking at amphibian assemblages. And so this was another master's student of mine, Diane Alex, who did this work. Close to the same 15 wetlands. There was a few different ones, but she used 15 wetlands and did seasonal surveys of amphibians and how they might use these. Amphibians are oftentimes very good indicators of habitat quality. And so if they are, they're not, if the habitat's there, you could expect them to be there. They're not as transient as other organisms. And so using a combination of constrained searches where we would just literally go out seasonally and set up plots and just scour the area and identify any amphibians. We also used what we call our frog loggers, which are basically recorders, and recorded frog calls that in each of the wetlands on a seasonal basis. And she used this data to again develop, look at species diversity and develop some occupancy models related to land use and land cover. And so I'll just sort of show you, one of the things that we did afterwards is just to kind of categorize some of these wetlands. We had some that were highly urbanized where at least 5% of the watershed was urban, oftentimes much more than that. So these are our most urban. This blue bar in this case is another category. A lot of times that's just urban area that isn't necessarily impervious surface. So these were our most urbanized areas. We had a group of wetlands that were primarily forested watersheds, so more of our kind of reference conditions. And then we had sort of the grab bag, sort of more of a mixed land use, land cover of wetland types out there. And so one of the things we expected was that, well, these reference wetlands clearly are superior habitat. They're going to provide for a lot more amphibians in those wetlands. And when we looked at just looking at presence-absence data, that really didn't hold out. We actually, if you look at the ranges, at least in those three categories here, there's really no big separation between those three groups there. And certainly we had a whole suite of species that were sort of ubiquitous. We just found them everywhere. Cricket frog, southern toad, green tree frog, bronze frogs, the spring peeper, those were everywhere. But we did also find that there was about 5 species that were found in those forested wetlands, forested watershed wetlands, I should say, and none other. And so about half of these, oak toad, dwarf salamander, and the ornate chorus frog are actually sort of a state-listed species of concern. So we're picking up some of the more sensitive species on this list in terms of conservation value, only occupying these wetlands that are in these primarily forested watersheds. So we think this is concerning given the potential for urbanization in a lot of these areas. A lot of times, the reasons why some species persist and some don't is unclear. We think there's a combination of things going on. Some of the hydrologic effects I think are clearly going on here. Some of the data I was just showing you. But keep in mind as well, as we urbanize around these wetlands, we also disconnect upland habitats as well. A lot of these species are not just dependent upon the wetlands, but they utilize that surrounding upland habitat as part of their life cycle. And so that's going to be necessary for many of these species to persist. As land use changes, clearly that habitat becomes less available to them. And so the last thing I want to talk about as far as the research here is some work we've been doing with, this is a sea grant that we got to look at water quality intensely, and I'm just going to kind of show you what it is we're doing. We're sort of in the process of really analyzing some of the data here. But the idea that we wanted to get at is what is the value? Can we really quantify what effect these wetlands have in terms of potentially improving our water quality? And so we ended up selecting 4 wetlands that, again, represented different land use, land cover scenarios. And we wanted to use some of this data to improve some of our modeling capabilities. So I've been working with a colleague in Forestry and Wildlife, Latif Kalin, who does a lot of watershed modeling, and where we have an interest in sort of building in and sort of, basically accounting for headwater wetlands to make better estimations of our watershed outputs. So this is an example of one of the wetlands that we evaluated, and the approach that we took is to really evaluate water quality coming in and water quality coming out. In all cases, our wetlands are somewhat are altered in the sense that they all had a major inflow and outflow point associated with them. But in this case, this is a more agricultural setting here. But what we did in all cases is we had at the inflow point a water sampling station that consisted of a pressure transducer, so we're monitoring stage and using that to develop rating curves to estimate flow. And we had a ISCO water sampler set up. So we did a combination of grab sampling base flows and then storm flows using these ISCOs. From those ISCOs, from the stage data, the water level data, and complementary flow data, we can end up getting continuous flow data for each of our stations. So this is the inflow data for one of our Foley sites. And what we're able to do, in this case over it's about an 8-month period, is convert our stage data into continuous flow data. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is to actually start calculating loads of things like nitrogen and phosphorus coming into these wetlands. So we use these measures of flow, and we sample during base flow, but we also sample during storm flow. And capturing storm flow and water conditions during those events was challenging. We actually programmed the ISCOs to take a flow proportionate sample. So we got sort of a concentration of different water constituents, but it's essentially averaged over that storm event. So we're actually able to get, with the flow data that we have here and the average concentration across that storm event, we're actually able to get good representation of how much of different water quality constituents we have moving through these wetlands, both in and out. And so ultimately what we like to do is compare our inflows and our outflows and see how well wetlands are doing as far as retaining this material. And so this is just base flow data looking at concentration. So this isn't getting at how much, it's just getting at the concentration of water. But we're interested in looking at dissolved inorganic nitrogen, soluble phosphorus, total dissolved phosphorus. Clearly the concentrations show higher concentrations at the inflow than we do at the outflow. We've done a little bit of sort of back of the envelope calculations, and we're getting somewhere oftentimes between 30 to 50% load reductions from our wetlands. That water just passing from the inflow to the outflow is reducing the amount of those nutrients coming through there. And so ultimately, as I mentioned before, what we like to do is to consider this when we try to model how land use, land cover is going to affect water quality to local estuaries. And so, again, my colleague Latif Kalin has been developing SWOT models for Baldwin County for a little while now, exploring land use changes and looking at scenarios of future land use conditions to estimate what is going to be the change in water quality as we become more urbanized or as land use change expands. And so ultimately what we like to do is take into consideration the presence of these headwater wetlands, their functioning, and take that into account when we're making some of these kind of estimations. So just to summarize, headwater streams and wetlands are really these, they're these kind of ubiquitous systems that are out there, but historically have been neglected, but really critically important for a variety of functions that are important to us, important to society. And I think, a lot of what we've done here is very correlative in nature, but we're demonstrating pretty consistently that as we change the land use, oftentimes we change the capacity for these wetlands to provide some of those functions, whether it's habitat, biogeochemical, or hydrologic. I think this is the kind of thing that's critical when we start thinking about areas like Baldwin County. So I mentioned, the southern part of Baldwin County, the light green here, has been agriculture for a while. And there has been, most of the urbanization in the county has occurred in that part of the county, which is a different scenario than where maybe some of the urbanization is going to be in the future. If you look at where land use change is occurring now, there's certainly some of that still going on here, but if you go to places like Spanish Fort, Bay Minette, that is where a lot of, those are becoming sort of commuter towns for Mobile. People are moving out there. There's a State Road 39, I think, or 3, one of these that kind of connects Spanish Fort to Stapleton. It seems like every time I go out there, there's another subdivision that's come up there. This is, the point is, though, is that this is the area where we have a lot of forest cover in the county. Those are the areas now that are being converted to urbanization for urban, or to urban land use, not some of these agricultural areas. These are areas where right now we have some significant high-functioning wetlands. But how we manage that development is going to have a large hand in how much we protect those wetlands, conserve those functions, and maybe ultimately protect some of our coastal waters. We've been working and interacting with some of the municipalities down there to try to influence some changes in their ordinances to hopefully be responsive and try to, again, encourage development that is going to protect the integrity of these headwater wetlands. So there are ways to work around these areas. Urbanization is going to happen, but how we develop lands, we do have options. And there are some municipalities that have been a little more progressive about encouraging sort of low-impact development strategies. And so we're trying to work more with some of those municipalities and show them what we've seen. On a national scale, I want to mention real briefly that the topics of headwaters is actually very it's a big topic right now. And when we talk about wetland regulations, so wetlands are, and most wetlands, I should say, are actually protected. However, the level of protection over the last 15 years has declined. The scope or the jurisdiction of what are protected wetlands has been challenged. Isolated wetlands, for instance, those wetlands that do not have a hydrologic connection, oftentimes are now not protected. They aren't within the purview of the Corps of Engineers, which is the federal agency that manages wetland regulations. This is a few years back, this Rapanos decision was considered by the Supreme Court about this issue about adjacent headwater wetlands to streams and whether or not they had a viable effect on downstream waterways. The outcome from this was sort of a split decision where now it was sort of left on a case-by-case basis for the court to decide whether or not there was adequate reach or jurisdiction should be asserted or not. This is something that the EPA has been pursuing since this decision about trying to get an understanding about the role of headwater systems for downstream water quality. So it's still something that, as far as the practice, the regulations and how the law is enforced is still up in the air, and what kind of protection headwater systems are going to get. And then the final thought I wanted to share is there's a lot of interest right now after the Deepwater Horizon spill about restoring the northern Gulf Coast, and more often the thought is what can we do at this setting. One message I would have is that we need to also be thinking about what we can be doing in this setting, because if we look out 30, 50, 100 years from now, this is probably going to be a very different landscape. There's going to be a lot more people here. And so what happens in the conditions we have here and here is oftentimes going to be determined by what we do up in these upper reaches there. So I want to quickly acknowledge, over the years, we've had students sort of come and go and people we've worked with, and of course, the graduate students we all know do all the heavy lifting and the hard work. So I want to do a quick shout out to them. I've had multiple faculty. Try to be an interdisciplinary lab, but that requires you to work and interact with a lot of different people with other expertise, and I've really enjoyed that. And so I'll put up a few of our funding and collaborating sources, and happy to take any questions.